Hello, everyone tuning in. Welcome to our Fireside Chat. So our Fireside Chat today is going to be focused on the theme of sustainable food and agriculture. So if you have been following our Fireside Chats, these are hosted with the Impact Collective community. So Impact Collective is a community-driven impact acceleration and investment program run across Asia Pacific. We're halfway through our program, and every single week, we spotlight inspiring speakers and entrepreneurs who are focusing on some of the thematic areas that our impact makers are also focused on. So this week is food and agriculture, and I'm really excited to introduce you to Matthew Monahan. Before we go into the details though, if you are new to AirMe, welcome to our virtual stage. I encourage you to use these emojis down below. You'll see in the bottom row, I can see some folks are already using it. You can give us reactions throughout the Fireside Chat. You also have a chat box over on the right-hand side, so do say hello and tell us where you're dialing in from, which country are you coming from, and a warm welcome to our impact makers as well who are in the room with us. And if you do have questions, we're going to have a dedicated section to have some questions. We'll bring you up on stage as well to ask them directly to Matthew. Please use the Q&A. There's a little section right next to chat on the top right. But I think we should jump in. Welcome, Matthew. Welcome to AirMeet, and welcome to our Fireside Chat today.
Great. Thanks, Stephanie.
Thanks for joining us all the way from New Zealand. I know it's really late, your time zone, but we really appreciate it. We have a lot of people here who are really curious to hear your story. And we're going to get into that in a bit, but I think your experiences charting your journey of your entrepreneurial journey from the US and Silicon Valley all the way through to where you are now in New Zealand and working on regenerative agriculture, it's a fascinating one. So I'd love for you to maybe share your story rather than me creating that introduction. And it's a non-linear one, so we can try to go in chronological order a bit, but feel free to jump around where it makes sense. But tell us a bit more about your origin story and what's brought you to where you are now.
Great. Yeah. Well, kia ora. Hello, everyone. It's good to be with you. I come from the Midwest of the United States originally, and my whakapapa, my genealogy was German and Irish from my grandparents. And then I made my way to California for school, and had really just been a serial entrepreneur my whole life. But I'm very privileged to have expressed that entrepreneurial impulse in a variety of domains and different ways. And so my brother Brian and I started a company called Inflection back in 2006. We were just, throwing ideas against the wall, weren't taking it super seriously, thought we might do it for a year or two. But that turned into, a real business. And so that was a software technology company. We were essentially in the kind of big data space, helping digitize public records and documents. And it turned into a genealogy business. And then we were fortunate to sell that company to Ancestry.com in 2012. And I think that was a turning point for both of us to kind of say, okay, well, we learned a lot about entrepreneurship and business, but the world's kind of, has a lot of big challenges. And so how can we contribute and be a bit more aligned with our passions and skills, in particular around climate issues. And so we've kind of spent the better part, I guess, of the last 10 years in different areas and aspects, all things around ecological and climate-related crises and challenges ahead. So we have kind of a family foundation. We put aside some capital and created a spend down fund for supporting really early stage and various ecological initiatives and projects, which I can talk about through the Namaste Foundation. We also helped start with Yosef Aeli and Songy's connected, and many folks in the Impact Collective are connected to the Edmund Hillary Fellowship out here in New Zealand. So we left Silicon Valley in 2016, packed up with the whole family. We all moved to New Zealand, and really Aotearoa, New Zealand for us represents kind of a fertile ground for experimentation and kind of creating in this environmental space, whether it's from a policy perspective or whether it's from actually getting our hands dirty. So we live in a place called Mangaroa, which is where I'm standing right now, and we have a farm project here, and so that is the predominant thrust of my attention and focus, called Mangaroa Farms. And basically, we are starting with land that is prototypical for farming and agriculture in New Zealand. So it's a predominantly pine radiata, monocrop forestry, plus an old dairy farm. And so really, we wanted to be in the inquiry and in the practice of what does that conversion process look like from kind of more industrial or monocrop oriented forms of agriculture into more mixed organics, future food, future of farming, and how do we wrap education and community in the same holistic context with that. So yeah, that's probably more than enough to get started, but that's a bit about my journey, Stephanie.
Amazing. I'm really curious to go from starting, growing, and selling a technology business in Silicon Valley, moving to New Zealand, and really starting this journey of ecosystem building and bridging the startup ecosystems between New Zealand and the rest of the world, and now really stewarding a piece of land towards education and reinventing what sustainable agriculture can look like. That's pretty fascinating. What is it that drew you to New Zealand? Out of all the places in the world, when you spun that globe or you're looking around for, where can I take this next step? Why New Zealand?
Yeah, I mean, I've always been drawn to this kind of culture of early stage, building something new, experimentation, and New Zealand in many ways represents that. It's one of the youngest countries in the world. It has pioneered a number of model-setting policies throughout history, whether you look at first country in the world for women's voting, whether you look at the founding treaty of this existing governance structure being a treaty with the indigenous people, the Māori people, and that really being kind of our version of the constitution here in New Zealand. Whether you look at the non-nuclear policy that was set in the 80s, there's just a number of examples where New Zealand has been out front, and I think that it is in a very good position to also be out front as it relates to climate and sustainability. Roughly a third of the land here in New Zealand is stewarded by the Department of Conservation, and it's in its DNA, it's an agricultural country. That being said, it's got a lot of big challenges. So the unique advantage is there's only 5 million people here. So, everyone's 2 degrees of separation away. And so in terms of the ability to move really fast and quickly and experiment and get to the right people, whether they're in business or in government or in the nonprofit space or in the community or whomever, it's completely different than what I was used to in California. So, those things just made for a really rich, fertile environment to express our entrepreneurial instincts. And then it's just an amazing place to be and live. And so, we're out here on a rural farm. Stephanie's been out to the farm. I mean, it's rural, it's out there, but we really love it as a place to live as well.
Yeah, I've visited New Zealand a couple of times, and there's always been something particularly special about the quality of connection there. And I can see the contrast that you're speaking of in terms of Silicon Valley. You might have a lot of people and great density, but weaker ties generally, or at least community ties. Whereas in a place like New Zealand, you can really foster those connections much more closely. And there's a type of, I think, interdependency that's woven into some communities that have that kind of demographic that you're talking about. And yeah, what really, really interesting. I can't wait to go back over there again. I know that I've been really, really inspired also by hearing you've spoken about some of the really pioneering ways that New Zealand has, I think acknowledged their interdependence with nature. I think one of the striking case studies I've followed has been the rights to personhood and for nature and how that's been really stewarded. So yeah, what a fantastic contrast, but a really, really fertile soil, as you're saying, to experiment and grow these types of initiatives. We have two startups in our current cohort from New Zealand, actually, and they're working on environmental initiatives and really, really cool stuff. So I can see that too, that it is a really, really cool breeding ground for new ideas and community support for new ideas as well. You had mentioned the Namaste Foundation that you had started, and I think something that you had mentioned through that is that there is a major gap in grant making for environmental causes at large. And so Namaste Foundation is using permaculture principles to address some of these gaps in grant making and ensure that projects that deserve this type of support are helped off the ground. What do you think is the reason for that major gap? Why have traditional philanthropic or other forms of funding support been able to support environmental causes?
Yeah, it's a good question and one that's certainly dear to my heart. When we started Namaste Foundation, we did not have the purview to be just environmental projects and causes. We were doing grants in the criminal justice reform space, which there's a lot of activity happening in Northern California around that. We were doing other social justice causes as well. But as we dug in deeper, what we realized was that our focus could only be so wide, and since we were predominantly focused, in the ecological space, it just made more sense to focus on organizations in that field. But B, that the severity of underfunding for environmental causes is one of the real tragedies of philanthropy. So just to share some statistics that have been corroborated and verified across many different sources. So if you think about philanthropy in general, if a donor puts $1 into what's the pool of philanthropic resources, there's typically about 5 to 6% of that will flow out in a given year. So oftentimes, you'll take the tax deduction and put your dollar away in a donor advised fund or in a foundation or whatever, but then you only have to give out 5 to 6 cents of that dollar. And that allows donors to be patient in terms of how they get their capital and also to grow the endowment while they do the grant making. And that's been kind of the traditional way that philanthropy has been structured for a long time. Now, if you look at that flow, then of that 5 to 6 cents, roughly 5%, it's actually 3 or 4%, but let's say 5% of that flow is actually granted to environmental projects or environmental related organizations in a given year. So what it means is that 5% of 5% of every dollar in philanthropic capital is actually making its way into environmental causes, or kind of another way to say it is 2.5 tenths of 1 cent of every dollar in the Earth's hottest years on record in the midst of a climate emergency that we all face. So it's quite stark, and I think that there's a lot of different contributing reasons, but from my perspective, like it really just comes down to our collective blind spot towards all things ecological and environmental. The industrial age and the information age has kind of led us down a path of not necessarily remembering that we are an intricate part of the web of life, and we actually have to care for all of these species and ecosystems that care for us and that enable the conditions for life on the planet. So I think that therefore is kind of the torch that we carry with the work of Namaste Foundation. And what I've been seeing in kind of 10 years of grant making is that there are a lot of phenomenal early stage projects that are often a bit unnoticed by the larger philanthropic institutions. And so it's kind of like, having an early stage startups, but no VCs or no angel investors to back them. So there's a lot of, founders and, people like in this impact collective that are working on these areas, but are just having a really difficult time getting access to the funding streams. So that's kind of a bit of the context.
Yeah, and it's really tragic in many ways because we need early stage capital, or specifically grants, to help support some of these earlier, riskier ideas. Otherwise, we don't push them forward, even to get to the stage where they might become investable or funded by larger philanthropic grants. There needs to be a way for us to push through slowly and support, particularly local initiatives. Like when we think of ecological care, a lot of these things are very place-based as well. So the solutions that we might find that work in our, close ecology, they're really unique solutions, and by default will be small scale. So I just think it's these types of initiatives, this size of funding and support, it's such a critical part of the bigger, support infrastructure. If we want to fund large scale, solutions that are really going to change the world, we also need to start with supporting, smaller projects, local projects. So I think it's able to support that niche that's really critical when we look at that larger view. And you've spoken to also when making decisions about funding different projects, you've spoken to these permaculture principles. I think you called it earth care, people care. I'd love to hear a bit more about what inspired that in your approach to grant making. And also, has that inspired other parts of your life, even other parts of your business or your personal life as well, these permaculture principles? What does it mean to you?
Yeah, so permaculture, I'm sure, it's a familiar term, but it's really a design methodology or a set of principles. And I think one of the defining characteristics of permaculture is its holistic approach. And so recognizing that there's a lot of different interconnected parts of a system. And I think that to me embodies a lot of the healing and the solutions that we need to approach a variety of aspects of our modern society, is taking a more holistic approach. So, as it relates to ecology and the food system, I think that permaculture is a great design methodology and set of practices. And so, yeah, we hadn't really seen many people in philanthropy talking about it, and certainly not foundations. And so we made it a bit of our summary, philosophy. And so it's people care, it's earth care, and it's fair share. And I think how that shows up in philanthropic contexts, one, recognizing that most grants to nonprofits are really, especially in this earlier stage conversation, are really to enable the team to make their bills and have a living wage to be able to do the work that they're doing. And so, I think that sometimes people hear nonprofits and they immediately think of traditional aid, like Red Cross style, what percentage of every dollar is going to the end recipient? And in most contexts that we're interfacing with, that's not really the right way to frame it. It's actually, 100% of the dollars, or most of the dollars, are going to pay the staff, because that's the people, the main cost item to enable this organization to function. And they're usually working at half the rate of what they could get in the private markets. And so, therefore, our approach is to really focus on the spirit of gift. And I think that's also, the nomenclature in philanthropy is often about grants, and we try to continually bring the word gift into it. And so it's like when you give a gift, you don't say, "Here, I'll give you this gift, Stephanie, as long as you give me back an impact report at the end of the quarter and you hit these 3 milestones, and then you tell me about every, way that you spent that money." Like, a gift is, Stephanie, you're doing amazing work. We believe in you. We've vetted you. We've done the work and the homework. Here's a gift. Please keep going. Like, thank you for doing what you're doing. And we recognize that you're extremely strapped for time, energy, support, capital, etc. And so we don't want to get in the way of that. And we just want to be additive and value add. And so that's kind of the spirit in which we approach the people care aspect. Earth care is kind of the predominant focus. And I think within earth care, I would highlight that, you know, it's a little bit, it almost sounds traditional or boring, but like conservation is one of our most obvious opportunities. Like an ecosystem that has, like, so, you know, I live in a place where there's a lot of land where we're kind of starting from scratch again. Like, okay, this land has been farmed and there's a lot of metals in the ground from the fertilizers, or there's a lot of tree stumps from all the chopped down trees, or there's a lot of species that don't really belong in this space. And so how do we regenerate? How do we start new? And when I go through that, I'm just always humbled by, like, this takes a really, really long time. It's really difficult to regenerate an entire ecosystem, and you can't push nature to do it faster and faster. You can only kind of make small adjustments and interventions. And so when you compare that to, like, you know, I've walked into multi-thousand-year-old forests where the complexity of life and the biodiversity and the relationships between all of these different ecosystems are so elaborate that I couldn't possibly, you know, trace all of the different things that have resulted in this. And then you find out that, oh, the logging companies are going to take that forest out, and you're like, oh no. That's not something that we can just reverse a decision around for the next generation. And so I think protecting old growth existing ecosystems should just be like one of the top banner priorities for humanity. And unfortunately, that space is still severely underfunded as well. And there's a lot of important struggles in that space. So we tend to think about, you know, conservation opportunities as well as these kind of model transitions. Like, what does regenerative agriculture look like? How do we move to a more sustainable food system? And part of the thesis there is, like, how we grow our food is the most determinant and influential way in which we do land use as a species. And so if we can change food, we can kind of change everything else. And then the last thing I'll say is kind of fair share is the third kind of permaculture principle, summation. And we really think about that as kind of, you know, an appropriateness of allocation of resources, including to ourselves. You know, like, we've chosen to do what's called a spend down approach to philanthropy, where we're not keeping the money in a bank account and then giving away 5% a year and holding that money in perpetuity, but we're actually just spending it down over a 10-year period of time to zero. Because it's like, you know what, the context of our time calls for an accelerated approach to giving. And this idea that, like, make money, get old, leave it all in a will, pass it down to the next generation, maybe my grandkids will do something with it. It's like, you know, let's actually just get out there and do it now, because that's the pace at which our world demands it.
Yeah, I love that. I hope there are funders in this room or listening to this as well. I think there's a really disruptive sort of process innovation required in philanthropic giving, and disruptive not in a sense but like a different way of giving. And I really like these principles. One of the things I wanted to share about the first point is, like, weaving this trust and reciprocity among funders or grant giving organizations and individuals and grantees. I think sometimes we need to really adjust that power dynamic. And you spoke to that before. It's like, I'll give you this, and in return, you know, give me all these things. I think we set really unhealthy relationships with those we give to. And I've been seeing some really interesting philanthropic organizations taking more of a learning lens. So don't give me anything back. You don't have to give me what you promised on paper, because we know also the stuff we work with is really emergent. But what's more important is you're learning. Like, with this support I'm giving you, you're learning and you're growing, and you're sharing that learning with others. So I think we're on the cusp of some really different ways, I think, of reimagining our relationship with giving and receiving. And I think this also ties back to what you were talking about before around relationships and trust structures as well. And I don't know to what extent are your grantees in New Zealand versus around the world? Is it a bit of a mixture?
It's been growing here in New Zealand because it's where we're spending our time. So it's about two-thirds, I think, this year. And then maybe 20-25% in the States and California, and then the rest globally.
Nice.
Because it is relationships, like you said.
It's relationships and trust. Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm. So I love that because it's self-reinforcing, and again, it's its own ecosystem and interdependency as well. And on your second point, it was such a beautiful articulation of the complexity of our ecological systems and the need to not just look ahead, but like preserve what we have now. I think generally we have such an obsession with the new and the shiny and what's in the future. And sometimes we fail to really preserve what's right in front of us. Your point about timescales, like when you look at the timescale of nature, it has been through so much more than you'll ever see in your lifetime, experience so much more. And I don't know if you've read the Overstory, but as you were sharing, I had these visions of like being in that book. So if anyone's listening and you'd like an incredibly spiritual journey into the life and the wisdom of of trees and our world, like check out the Overstory. Beautiful book. It's fiction, but yeah, sounds like you've read it as well.
Yeah, I've listened to it in the gardens. It's on Audible as well.
Yeah. Oh, it's so good. But you brought me there with your words as you were explaining. But yeah, thank you so much for sharing. And I really do genuinely hope that if there are funders listening to this, like consider, how you might inspire different ways of giving. How might permaculture principles or design principles play into the work that you're doing as well? And I'm really curious because I think this helps also bring to life the portfolio. I've had a look at some of the projects that you've supported, the social enterprises, the not-for-profits. There's a huge range. Are there any in particular that you can tell us a story about, any particular projects that you're excited about right now or that you're really proud to have supported?
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many, and yeah, so I'll just pick, an example that has been more recent, which is a project called The Learning Environment here in New Zealand. It's a group of young Kiwis who have been on this journey for a few years now, and they essentially sought to find a piece of land where they could build an outdoor educational regenerative farm experience. And so we really resonated with how they were approaching it. By the grace of many donors, we were able to kind of join up and help them acquire a piece of land that is right next to the Wanganui River, which happens to be iconic in New Zealand in part because of its living personhood status in that rights of nature conversation, Stephanie, that you mentioned. And part of the thesis of why I find that project so compelling, besides the fact that it's just an amazing group of people and the right conditions and all this, community support, is the ecological education piece. I think is another one of those obvious but really important and maybe underappreciated areas that we can invest a lot more in. As I've embarked in this work and as I've just even tried to learn myself, I feel like I'm such an amateur newbie, like I'm like an armchair ecologist, like I just barely scratching the surface at understanding all of these different aspects, whether it's in the agricultural space, the conservation space, and, what's going on in the oceans, what's going on in the atmosphere. Like there's so much information here to try to kind of grasp. And so it would be, a lot better if we were getting some of these fundamental learnings and principles at an early age. So I didn't grow up with a garden in the school. I didn't grow up learning how to, cook food. I didn't like basic life skills, and these things are kind of been stripped from a lot of modern educational systems. And I know that's not true everywhere in the world, but it's certainly true in a lot of the Western world. And so getting back to those basics in ecological education, but it's not done through a classroom. It's done hands-on. It's done on the land. It's done outdoors, and it's also an all ages kind of thing. So what the learning environment's doing is kind of building this living campus where you are on land where it's regenerating, and you have the market garden, and you have the orchard, and you have the different projects happening, but you're also immersed in it. And so it's an experiential approach. And shortly after they were able to get the land, everything moved into the charitable trust, et cetera, they got their first contract with government to bring a conservation course into an accredited classroom. And so now they have students coming out from the classroom, out to the land and doing conservation curriculums. And it's kind of an early wedge into what does conservation education really look like across schools. So really excited about that one.
That is really, really cool. And so their campus is open now. If people are visiting New Zealand, would they be able to check it out?
Yeah, they do an amazing thing called Open Farm Fridays, and I'll put the link here in the Air Meet as well. And they would be delighted to welcome folks in. And yeah, I mean they're just off to the races.
That's so exciting, and a really powerful story and case study potentially for other communities, countries to adopt as well. I really like that they're looking at, not just looking to integrate, how can they shape the system that exists as well? Because to your point, we have to be addressing it at a really early stage. And so rather than being, something that's accessed independently alone, but looking how they can influence the system. And I think systems thinking is something all of our entrepreneurs at IC are really thinking about as well. Like, how do their solutions weave into the existing infrastructure as well, so we can make the biggest impact. I'm really excited to follow that. And on my next trip to New Zealand, fingers crossed, a bit of a visit there would be amazing.
Definitely.
Nice. And I'd like to shift a little bit to where you are situated right now. So you mentioned your most recent project is Mangaroa Farms. So what was the impetus to really get your hands dirty, literally and figuratively, into this space? And what's your collective vision for Mangaroa Farms looking forward?
Yeah, so I spoke a bit to the origin thesis, how to really embody that transition and learn it through doing in terms of the land project. And I think integral to any of this work is community. And so, it's like it's an impossible task for one person even to just run a sustaining market garden, right? Like, this requires groups of human beings to come together. And so we are, a farmland project, but we're also a community of people that are living in and around this area and this space. And we all occupy different ecological niches in this web of life. Some of us are, doing it expressed with a shovel in our hands. Some of us are doing it through Zoom calls. Hopefully an appropriate balance of each. But I think the vision is to be in a regenerative, harmonious relationship with life, to bring this place to life as a food basket for our local community. So we're working a lot around just how do you relocalize those different value flows of where people are getting their fruits and vegetables and their meat and their eggs and their dairy, and how do people come together around around food, and what are the educational contexts and experiences and touch points that we can create in that process, so that it's fun and light and also substantive, whether that's learning how to make soil or whether that's learning how to cook some new food. And then on top of that, really putting an emphasis around resilience and the conditions for the young people to thrive. And so we have a number of babies and toddlers in this community, and I think many more, coming. And so yeah, just thinking a lot about what do they need, because they're going to be inheriting the planet as we know it, and what are the educational experiences that we can provide to them. So, we're it's all like still emergent and messy, and there's a million things that are always on the to-do list, and land projects are hard, and living in community is hard, and all the rest. But New Zealand's a terrific place to do it, and that's all part of the journey.
Nice, and really bring to life, back to what you were saying before, just like experiential learning principles, really bringing that into a community context. And I think that's really exciting. I love the aspect of multi-generational living as well. I think that's something our society, or generally in a lot of big cities, we haven't been able to, create those communities that have given us a whole wealth of, knowledge and growth and strength that we no longer have as much exposure to in these fragmentations. So I think that's also such an exciting lens to have. You were talking about the complex and the messy and the emergent, and I'm kind of curious, what lessons do you feel, hopefully you haven't shedded all of, or maybe you have, I don't know how much of the entrepreneur from Silicon Valley you brought into the farm, but what lessons do you think you've taken from your past chapter? Maybe you've brought it into this chapter, or it has transformed in some way. What lessons have you brought into your approach now, building out Mangaroa Farms with this community? Any entrepreneurial kind of lessons you brought in?
Yeah, I think, even though this is not, fast-paced corporate Silicon Valley work on the computers using technical software skills, the same way. The skills and experiences from corporate and Silicon Valley and technology and entrepreneurial contexts, I think, are not just, helpful, but really vital to this aspect of work as well. And I think there's a lot of things that technology and entrepreneurship can teach organizations and projects in both the environmental space as well as the nonprofit space. So I'm certainly, always kind of wearing a hat maybe of both worlds, or multiple worlds. And, like today we had a team meeting, and we had the all hands team meeting, and the languaging changes, but instead of referring to things as quarters, I'm referring to things as seasons. And instead of, calling, necessarily using language like KPIs or, some of the things I was used to doing in the corporate context. It's just a more gentle approach to so what are the goals for spring season? And, so we look at the end of, spring, and we look backwards, what are the things we want to have achieved? And so there's kind of certain operational disciplines that you learn when you're in a larger organization that can be applied. And then, technology is like tools, and we are a tool making species, and our tools can keep getting better and build upon, other tools. And so, I embrace the use of tools as we're building out Mangaroa Farms. And so, my to-do lists are all in software, and my planning is all using project management software tools, and I'm logging databases of, the trees that we grew last season, and spreadsheets, and tracking KPI, and it's like that stuff. I find myself in an environment where some of the local residents that have lived here far before me are still just getting on the email, and so it's a different context and culture, but so it's value add once you kind of stitch some of these newer ways of being able to streamline information flows, do one-to-many communications, research and find things that have been figured out elsewhere and bring it to the farm, communicate with other community land projects through video conferencing to talk about what are you learning, what are you figuring out, and how can we do that. So it's all interconnected.
And being able to leverage those networks of other initiatives creating change, creating your own learning environments as well. Do you see this movement expanding across New Zealand? Do you see it expanding in other parts of the world? And how connected is Mangaroa Farms at the moment to other initiatives that are happening around the place?
Yeah. I think we are just, stepping into a slipstream that has been happening both in this current context of like eco villages and regenerative land projects, and then also, cultures that have existed for thousands of years that had a more harmonious relationship with the planet, modernizing or maybe not modernizing, but making these types of practices appropriate for the modern conditions of life is something that we're all figuring out. We have a more remote work, nomadic kind of culture now, with sometimes things like international air travel, other times things like a global pandemic. And so, we're all adjusting and adapting, but I've found it extremely helpful to talk to other communities and land projects. And before we really got going here, I spent a lot of time traveling and visiting a number of places. It's kind of the initial preparations of, okay, for places that have been doing this for some time, what have they figured out? And one thing I'd say, just kind of bringing it to the topic of the evening, is like organizing around food was a consistent theme, and having a centerpiece of focus, not always, but often be around the kind of experience of food, bringing people together around the meal table, growing food. It's kind of a binding agent of who we are as humans in local communities. And so I think that piece really deserves a lot of emphasis.
I love that 100%. And I hope in this next session, I can see a couple of questions already popping in. We have makers in the Philippines and Thailand and Indonesia working on different aspects of the issue. Again, also looking at centering on food as that placemaking for conversation around our relationship to land, because like you said, it's this binding force. We all depend on it. And the more that we recognize its connectivity to the land that we're stewarding and supporting as well, I think a lot of our startups are also, really tapping into that consciousness. I've been seeing more and more projects in Asia. I'm based in Thailand now, so I've been noticing more, and I don't know if it's a product of being able to just noticing it because I'm paying more attention, or really seeing a momentum of growth, and whether that's been pushed by pandemic, pushed by COVID. But there has been like a centering in into your own community and, what's available locally when supply chains, get cut off, and you start to recognize what's around you more. So there's an element of timing which makes it really exciting, I think, to be working on food, working on our systems, environmental systems, and agriculture as well. Oops. Are you there, Matthew? I think might be my video. Am I coming through?
Oh, there you are. Can you hear me?
Yes. Amazing. Okay, I can hear you. Yeah, and before I jump over to some of the questions we've been receiving, I think what's really interesting is the more that we educate, the more that we bring this consciousness to the fore and educate communities, the more that communities can start to drive these decisions. One of the biggest principles of Impact Collective is having community-driven support towards these startups, towards these initiatives that are growing. So it's not necessarily, investors in a room making decisions on their own, but they're really responding to what, citizens of this earth believe are solutions that are worth investing in, that are ideas worth investing in as well. So I think as we see this groundswell movement grow, I'm feeling really positive that some of the ideas in our current cohort, solutions in our cohort, but even more can be supported as well. Awesome.
Stephanie, my internet connection. Hey, my internet connection is cutting out. I'll be right back in 1 second. I'm just going to reconnect.
No worries. If anyone was in any doubt whether Matthew was on a farm in New Zealand, this is the proof that, sometimes we're in rural areas and connection isn't always 100%. Yeah, hashtag rural life. Some of the, maybe the downsides of living on a rural farm. Cool. So hopefully we're going to get Matthew back really soon. I can see a bunch of questions in the Q&A, so I'm really excited to shift over to those in a bit. If you haven't had a chance to add your questions, please put it into the Q&A section on AirMeet. Are we back?
I think so. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hashtag rural life.
Totally.
Yeah.
Songy knows this as well. So we have two different internet connections depending on what's working at any given time.
No worries at all. Amazing. Well, I think we're going to shift into some Q&A with our impact makers. But one thing I'd love to leave our audience with is, for those who might be joining us and learning about these principles for the first time, whether it's permaculture, regenerative agriculture, food systems, are there any resources that you love that have helped you on your journey of learning about this space and inspired you a lot? It can be organizations to follow, people to follow, podcasts, books, anything like that we could leave some of our friends watching.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many, and I think it really has, it just has to do with kind of what someone's interested in going deeper on. One fun project that we love to support is called Happen Films. I just threw the link in there, and they have all sorts of like little 10 to 20 minute short video vignettes and stories about different projects. They weave kind of the philosophies and approaches, and it's predominantly New Zealand oriented, but that would be just one that quickly comes to mind.
Oh, awesome. Thank you so much. So for those of you looking to get inspired and have a little bit more of an exploration in this area, check out Happen Films. And I think we are now going to switch off the live stream. So goodbye to our friends dialing in from different parts of the world. We're going to have like a little intimate couch fireside session with our impact makers. All right, switch over. Okay, so Marta, just checking that okay, yes, we are now intimate. Hopefully that shouldn't be taken out of context. We are now in a closed fireside chat. There's a big roaring fire. How's the weather in New Zealand right now? Is it
amazing? It's always sunny and beautiful in New Zealand.
Now you're really selling New Zealand. Yeah, you're like, everyone come to New Zealand.
Yeah, no, they call it Windy Wellington for a reason, but yeah, no, it's been a beautiful spring.
Wonderful. Okay, so we have a couple of questions in here. IC team, also help me out if you see any questions that I might be missing. Let's see, we've got a question from Brian. I'll work my way up from the top. Brian, are you here and would you like to join us on stage to ask Matthew your question? Excellent. Okay, Brian's here. So Brian, I'm gonna try and bring you on stage now, but I might need Marta's expert help. Excellent. Brian, can you hear us?
I can, thank you.
Welcome. Would you like to share your question with Matthew?
Yeah, I would. Good morning, Matthew from the UK. Very inspirational what you've done, I have to say. And a lot of the things that you've mentioned today really resonate with me. And I think what I would like to ask, given your experience within Silicon Valley and how you've taken, what you've done and reinvented yourself a little bit from a technology focus now to a sort of environmentalist. As founders of companies who have ideas, about how to make a difference in the world, and I'm talking now about social entrepreneurs rather than just capitalist entrepreneurs. How do you get investors to buy into those ideas? Because I think one of the key things that I've seen from my own experiences is that investors usually like to see balance sheets rather than ideas, and it's how you can manage to persuade them to look at the bigger picture, the sort of holistic vision of what you're trying to create, and draw that investment in to try and make then a difference. I just looking for some insight about how you model that. How do you, develop an investment deck that can, provide an investor with not just with the ideas that you have, but the sort of journey that you would like to go on.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thanks, Brian. I think my general mental model would be, bad news first. Like, it's incredibly hard to raise money for non-traditional kind of social enterprise or environmental projects. And like, I'm not here to try to communicate anything, that is like hopium that somehow this is easy. Like, the system is fundamentally broken in terms of capital formation for this type of work. It's kind of the consequence of the system we're in. So we're kind of fighting, two battles at once. One is to kind of get your idea off the ground and everything else, but the other is just to actually, operate in a system where the whole reason these opportunities exist is because these problems are being perpetuated by the way that we do it right now. So, bad news aside, like, I do think that, as Stephanie said, like, we're seeing a rise in consciousness, and there is a lot of capital that's moving into the space of impact investment and social enterprise. And so my main kind of way to think about it would be, if on one side you have kind of investors who may have capital, and you're trying to convince them, like, hey, I have this idea to change the world in this kind of way, and that might require doing things differently. Or on the other side, you have, maybe a much smaller pool of capital and investors, but who already understand the thesis, and they're like, hey, we're social enterprise, or hey, we're impact investment focused, and here's what we do. I would go after that second pool. I think my experience has just been, it's hard to convince people, to kind of invest away from their theses and away from the way that they're incentivized and structured and so forth, into this kind of more social enterprise space. I think it's much easier as a founder to just go after people who already kind of get what you're doing. I'm happy to also speak to kind of a little bit of a tangential topic, but for me, kind of the frontier of learning and emphasis, which is, I think crypto actually is our way out of this mess in terms of the capital formation problem. Because I think what cryptocurrencies is going to enable are new ways of aligning the incentives and the liquidity that happens with time, and the way that the money comes together, and who votes on which projects get funded, and all of those things up and down the stack are now going to go through a transformation. And I think that we have an opportunity as founders to kind of move in that direction, but it's not ready yet. So if you're trying to go raise $2 million tomorrow for a social enterprise project, like, I don't know that crypto is necessarily the answer. But I do think that that's a directionally important aspect of the conversation.
Thank you. That's insightful. And again, from my perspective, I think, when we're trying to report on these things, transparency and governance is going to be hugely important. And I think, it's going to be up to, the likes of Impact Collective and people like yourself, who can sort of come together to help design, the sort of data models that we're going to require to create the right type of information, because otherwise the sort of larger corporates will dictate, what sort of information is being fed back to society. So again, I think, it's really important that, as a sort of social gathering, we start to develop these things going forward. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks.
Brian. That's a really great question. And yeah, something that also I see is really looking to experiment with and actively, exploring how do we democratize capital allocation processes? How do we, and I think there's still a lot more, but I agree this consciousness, the question is coming up more. And because of technology, there are more opportunities for us to actually set up these systems and processes that are different from business as usual. Now, I want to bring up next Mayur. He has a somewhat related question, but more around sort of the need for patient capital. We've talked about different timescales, particularly for ecological or sustainability innovations. And right now, there's a bit of this chasm between current VC expectations and instruments. So Mayur, are you on stage? Could we bring you on stage to share this question if you are available? So Mayur is from Green Collective, which is one of our impact makers in the cohort this year, based in Singapore. Okay, looks like Mayur isn't here anymore, but did you want to say anything about this, Matthew?
I do think, contextually, like what I saw in Silicon Valley was that sustainable investing and kind of all things green, well, maybe not sustainable investing in sustainability, and especially things like clean energy, it was kind of in vogue for a brief period of time. Kleiner Perkins famously put together huge amounts of capital funding for it. I think this was maybe like 2005, 2006, and it spectacularly failed. And that wave of venture investment was kind of such poor returns that the next wave that formed around Web 2 and other areas really neglected. It was a bit scarred from going into that field and that space. And my general sense is now that pendulum is going to swing back, and it will probably show up in a lot of wonky ways with kind of this obsession over carbon credits and everything else. But I think in general, venture capital does tend to have 7 to 10 to 12 to 15 year types of timeframes for the maturation of companies. And that for most entrepreneurs is enough to at least show traction and progress in the projects that they're doing. So I think it's not necessarily inherently a flawed aspect of the VC model to be impatient as much as maybe, finding the right VCs who are more patient capital. I think that the model question is whether or not you're going to do something that's for profit, because for profit, demands that some of the value flow expresses itself through equity and comes back as a return. And that whole system is not always the right choice, especially for people working on environmental projects. So I think that's kind of the bigger question I would ask myself before taking VC money. But I do think VC money can be quite patient in many positive observations in that respect.
And to your point, the earlier that there's this whole range, right, of investors and styles of investment as well, and it's about finding that right fit. I'm definitely seeing a lot more nuance and complexity across instruments for investment and different sizes and scales. So I think that's an interesting space to watch as well. So we also have another question. I'd love to bring Amarit on stage. Amarit is joining us from Thailand, and he's really keen to understand, what are the next big things in food and ag? Have we hit peak clean alt proteins and or other innovations, in this space? What do you see as the next big thing in this space, or what have you been following? But Aim, if you're around, you want to share your question, add a bit more context and color to it? I invite you to come onto the stage if you are able to do so. Oh, okay. He might be on mobile, which prevents us from bringing him on stage, but AIM is one of the I've known Aim for a number of years. I would say he's the OG like innovation spotter and ecosystem builder in Southeast Asia. And so this is a great question. It's very Aim. Like, what are these great innovations that you're seeing in this space? Have we hit?
Yeah. Hey, Aim's also part of the Edmund Hillary Fellowship. So
Yeah.
to
Of course.
Yeah, so I think in general, like technology is going to, like frontier technologies, accelerating technologies is going to play a big role in how these spaces of food and ag and land use shape up. And we're probably collectively like not ready for the level of transformation that's coming, and it'll probably just look a lot different than most of us can currently outpicture. I don't think we're at peak alternative proteins or anything of the sort. I think that will continue to happen. My mental model on this is like, we tend, when systems break, when there's some sort of crisis that happens, we tend to revert back to what we know, and we tend to kind of downgrade into a more simplistic approach and a reactionary approach. And so, pandemic, like, you kind of take a step back. Okay, socially distance, wear masks, stay at home, right? Like and so with climate, the same thing I think will keep happening in a lot of local contexts around the world. So you'll have, a major flood or a major weather event, and you'll lose power in your community, whatever. And, where I come from originally in the States, like the first thing people would then do is like go to their local church to get their Salvation food basket from the Salvation Army. It's like what they know. And so I think that like what we currently have that we know is going to define a lot of our reaction to extreme climate changes. And we know that we can like start to produce these lab-based meats. And so if we start having pressure at the policy levels that say, we're now in full-on emergency mode, we've passed 1.5 degrees, we have to make drastic actions and so forth, I do think that we could start to see the rhetoric ramp up about eating less meat and replacing it with different alternatives in a way that could still significantly increase the size of that category. Yeah. I'm not making a comment there, though, that says I think that's necessarily the right approach. I just think that that's likely to be one of our reactions. I do think, animals get a really bad rap a lot of times. And it's actually our approach to how we do agriculture with animals that is the issue. But the animals can play a really important, vital role in the carbon flows of the ecosystem, and in terms of rebuilding soil and sequestering carbon and creating a regenerative flow and process for the human diet, I think is quite possible, and I've seen it. So. That kind of one comment, and then the other comment would just be like, bioengineering in general, like when you start applying the accelerating nature of software to the idea of like how to create different expressions of life, like, things like CRISPR and like we're gonna see some really crazy stuff. And one thing we've been thinking about in New Zealand lately is there's some research work that happened at MIT recently, and the idea of like essentially 3D printing wood is now something that we can start to conceptualize, and that like changes the entire demand equation on forestry. And how do you think about timber and logging and all of these economies that are kind of predicated on that notion, and what does that do downstream? And forestry typically works in like multi-decade planning cycles. And so when you talk about the next harvest being in 30, 40, 50 years, you're like, well, what if we can just print your table, or your desk? Like, are you really going to, see the same demand for what was considered a really kind of steady commodity? So I think in general, like this is all awesome for entrepreneurs, because this is all new design space where we can embrace and we can build new sustainable models. And it's like a responsibility that we all have to do this with integrity.
Absolutely. I think there's still, this is a very live space right now. And like the amount of innovation progress that we've been seeing just in the past 2 to 4 years has been incredible. And if we start to see this inflection happen at the pace it's happening, it's definitely a space to watch. I'm definitely going to be watching New Zealand closely too, a little bit more closely than I have been as well. And I think before we're going to shift into kind of a bit more of a round table so you can meet some of the makers, and that's how we'll close off the session. But before we jump into that, I do want to close with an ask and an offer. So one piece of advice that you would offer to our startups at IC, especially those who are in the food and ag sector, is there any sort of closing piece of advice that you'd want to share with them?
I mean, it sounds trite and obvious, but I think just really having an open mind and being adaptable, because all of these things we're talking about, like, I think it's very hard to predict the future or forecast where we're going. And so, I think we've been often trained as entrepreneurs to like have high conviction, like this is what I'm going to build, this is what I'm going to create, this is my vision, this is my forecast, this is how, and you do need that strength and that conviction. But at the same time, I think remembering that we're just like all in this collective human journey and we're trying to figure it out together. And there's going to be a lot of kind of weird things going on and disproportionate opportunities for value creation in ways that may not be where you started your focus. And so staying open to that will be really important. And I think it's also, commendable what you're all doing to be in relationship, in a fellowship, because being on that collective journey is just so much more fruitful and will give you more value creative opportunities as well, because you'll have these different relationships to call on.
Thank you so much for that. And to follow on, Matthew, you are part of our Impact Collective Fellowship.
Yes.
Well, you are part of this community.
Made it.
I'll ask you, how can we support you? Do you have any asks of us as fellow Earthlings on this journey, trying to do awesome things in this space together? How can we support you? How can we support you in Mangaroa and any of the things you're up to?
Yeah, well, I mean, hit us up if you can get through the New Zealand borders and into this country. Come give us a visit, and we love your feedback, and we love to have you on the farm. And I think in general, just be in touch. And so if there's anything that was shared tonight before I lose my voice that resonated, would love to hear it. But also if there's any whether you just need another set of eyes on a pitch deck or something like that, I'm always happy to help with the time and energy that I can commit to it.
Thank you so much. And I think, folks, you can find Matthew on ICC as well, and you can reach out to him on there. I have so enjoyed this conversation. I wish we had a real life, like, crackling fire and maybe some marshmallows that would just, like, take it up a couple of notches. But hey, I promise I'll come and visit New Zealand. I have, like, 1,000 more reasons to now and so many curiosities. My Maori is a bit rusty since our last lesson together, so I'm going to have to brush up on that. But thank you again for your time. I so enjoyed this and loved reconnecting with you and hearing more about your story. Thanks for being here.
Awesome. Thank you, Stephanie. Much appreciated, and thank you all.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to go into just a quick breakout for the last couple of minutes, a chance to say hi to Matthew and ask any final questions. Matthew, there's a table for you in AirMeet that will fit, I think, about 5 other people. And then there's also going to be an IC table. So any makers, if you need to talk to the IC team about anything, we're also going to be on another table. But with that, we will wrap up kind of the stage portion. And I'll ask Marta to help us out in closing this and